Part 1. Preface and Chapter 1 of Canada's 100 Days with the Canadian Corps from Amiens to Mons, August 8 to November 11, 1918. This is a LibriVox recording. All LibriVox recordings are in the public domain. For more information or to volunteer, please visit LibriVox.org. Recording by David Lawrence. Canada's 100 Days by John Livesey. Part 1. Preface and Chapter 1. Preface. This book has been written to give the Canadian people a clear, fuller concept of the wonderful work of the Canadian Corps during the 100 days. To that consideration every other has been subordinated. By identifying, so far as possible, the actual battle positions of individual battalions, it is hoped to stimulate local pride and interest in their respective territorial or recruiting areas. Difficulties were here encountered, both through absence of detailed official narratives and limitations of space. But if full justice had not been done each fighting unit, it is not from lack of application and goodwill. With this prime consideration always in mind, it has been sought to make the book intelligible to the general reader, as well as to the military student, and pains therefore have been taken to explain at length the former military technicalities and terminology that come within the common knowledge of the latter. Whenever practicable, the original and official sources drawn upon for description of operations have been quoted. Such may at times be a little tedious, but is preferable to loose paraphrasing, which, while denying the reader an inspection of the documentary evidence, makes heavy drafts upon his credulity. Thus the official report of the Corps Commander covering these operations have been reproduced practically in full, paralleling in its proper place the general narrative. This might be expected to make for confusion and overlapping, but in practice it has not altogether worked out that way, for whereas the official report deals mainly with technical aspects, the book itself seeks to clothe these with the pulsating life and color of the battlefield. The alternatives must have been either to have buried the official report in a lengthy appendix, or to have omitted it altogether. It is felt the right course has been followed because whatever the book may suffer from these occasional breaks in the story, this loss is overwhelmingly counterbalanced by placing before the reader in an accessible form this extremely valuable and compellingly interesting report, carrying with it the authority of an authenticated historic document. Among official or semi-official narratives, of which free use has been made, are those of the 1st Canadian Division, the 4th Canadian Division, the 4th Canadian Infantry Brigade, as well as several battalion narratives. Valuable material has been drawn from the narrative of the First Army, published by the London Times, entitled "The Final Blow of the First Army in 1918." The author is greatly indebted to a number of friends of all ranks in the Canadian Corps for information and suggestions. Special acknowledgment must be made to the very efficient work of Lieutenant J.I.P. Neal, Canadian Corps Survey Section, who throughout these operations superintended the Corps Map Section, and has now prepared the accompanying maps and plans. End of Preface. Chapter 1. The Situation on the Western Front. On July 18, 1918, Marshal Foch, supported by the new American levies, struck his hammer blow on the Marne. We shall hear a good deal in history of Chateau Thierry and the great victory, but it remains that, at the end of July, the West Front, the traditional West Front of Flanders, Picardy, and the Somme was intact, unpierced, to all seeming an impregnable wall built by German blood and iron. But it was not the line of 1917. The spring offensive had cramped its defenders into a narrower, a more perilous ring. In the north the enemy bivouacked on the field of Passchendaele, and from Mount Kemmel cast his shadow over the Channel ports. To the south he was knocking on the gate of Amiens, and thrusting through Montdidier at Paris. Only in the centre, at Souchez, on Vimy Ridge, and before Arras, where through all those fateful days of March and April the Canadian Corps had kept watch and guard, the line of 1917 stood firm. There is abundant evidence that at the end of July, while the enemy regarded the situation in the south as serious, and was preparing to admit that his last great offensive had failed, he still held the west front, the Somme, the Hindenburg line, and the valley of the Lys to be invincible, and counted on the British armies frittering away their strength upon its formidable defenses, as they had in 1916 and 1917. Further than that, he had actually in preparation a new offensive on the Amiens-Montdidier front, with which he hoped to restore the military balance in his favour. It was only after the Battle of Amiens, in which the Canadian Corps took so glorious and leading a part, that he began to despair. Ludendorff clearly admits this in his book. The defeat of our arms on August 8th in the Franco-British offensive near Albert and north of Montdidier finally resulted in our losing hope for a military victory, he writes. Conferences were held with Chancellor von Hertling, Admiral von Hintz, the Foreign Minister, and Field Marshal von Hindenburg on August 14, 15, and 16, and there was also a meeting of the Crown Council at which I clearly stated that the war could not be won militarily. The kick-off of August 8 at Amiens was the first general offensive attempted by the British armies in 1918, and the events leading up to it must be briefly rehearsed in order to get a true strategic picture. This can best be done in the words of Field Marshal Haig, as contained in his famous Victory Dispatch of December 21, 1918. After describing the weakened condition of the forces at his command following the enemy offensive, he says, "The German attacks, though they had failed to break the Allied line, had stretched the resources of the Allies to the utmost, while before Amiens and Hazebrouck they had brought the enemy within a short distance of strategic points of great importance. In these circumstances the possibility of an immediate renewal of the enemy's offensive could not but be viewed with grave anxiety." At the commencement of the period under review in early May, the Allied High Command repeatedly expressed the opinion that the enemy would renew his attacks on a large scale on the front Arras, Amiens, Montdidier. The strategic results to be obtained by the capture of Amiens, the separation of the French and the British armies, and an advance toward the sea along the valley of the Somme were very great, and might have well proved decisive. The enemy's opening offensive, in March and April, had already brought him within a measurable distance of success in this direction, and had carried his armies through practically the whole of our organized lines of defense. In short, the enemy still possessed a sufficient superiority of force to retain the initiative, and it was known he would be compelled to act within a comparatively limited time if he were to turn his superiority to account before it passed from him. These were the two main factors which had to be taken into consideration when deciding the policy of the British armies during the late spring and early summer. The common object of the French and ourselves was to tide over the period which must elapse until the growth of the American armies and the arrival of Allied reinforcements placed the opposing forces once more on a footing of equality. The situation was an anxious one, but, as it turned out, the enemy was in no condition to push a new offensive, and when it did come at last, he elected for a direct thrust at Paris from the Aisne front. Launched at the end of May, this great offensive swept steadily on until, despite the desperate resistance of the French, reinforced by British and American troops, the Marne was reached, and it culminated on July 15 with the opening east and southwest of Rheims of what was to prove the last enemy blow on the grand scale. On July 18 Foch struck his shattering counterstroke. Meanwhile the British armies on the west front had been engaged in what Field Marshal Haig describes as a period of active defense. This included local attacks, the building of a new system of railways behind Amiens, and the digging of 5,000 miles of trench. The lesson of the necessity for great depth of defense had been hardly learned in March. Coming to July, he says, 2 months of comparative quiet worked a great change in the condition of the British armies. The drafts sent out from England had largely been absorbed, many of the reinforcements from abroad had already arrived, and the number of our effective infantry divisions had risen from 45 to 52. This in addition to 9 British divisions engaged on the Marne. In artillery we were stronger than we had ever been. As a consequence, we entered early in June on a more ambitious local offensive operations, in which the Australians had a considerable share. By the end of July, he goes on, the reconstruction of the British armies had been completed, and the success of their various local operations had had a good effect. I had once more at my command an effective striking force, capable of taking the offensive with every hope of success when the proper moment should arrive. That moment now approached. At a conference held on July 23, Field Marshal Haig writes, "When the success of the attack of July 18 was well assured, the methods by which the advantage already gained could be extended were discussed in detail. The Allied Commander-in-Chief asked that the British, French, and American armies should each prepare plans for local offensives, to be taken in hand as soon as possible, with certain definite objectives of a limited nature. These objectives on the British front were the disengagement of Amiens and the freeing of the Paris-Amiens Railway by an attack on the Albert-Montdidier front. The role of the French and American armies was to free other strategic railways by operations farther south and east. It would depend upon the nature of the success which might be obtained in these different Allied operations whether they could be more fully exploited before winter set in. It was subsequently arranged that attacks would be pressed in a converging direction toward Mézières by the French and American armies, while at the same time the British armies, attacking toward the line of Saint-Quentin-Cambrai, would strike directly at the vital lateral communications running through Maubeuge to Hirson and Mézières, by which alone the German forces on the campaign front could be supplied and maintained. Such a movement would also threaten the group of German armies in Flanders, and, therefore, it was obvious of vital importance to the enemy to maintain intact his front opposite Saint-Quentin and Cambrai, and for this purpose he depended upon the great fortified zone known as the Hindenburg Line. It is necessary to keep this in mind, as it is the key to the extraordinary fierce resistance the enemy maintained throughout the critical days of the Battle of Cambrai. Summing up the general scheme of British operations, Field Marshal Haig says, "The brilliant success of the Amiens attack was a prelude to a great series of battles, in which, throughout 3 months of continuous fighting, the British armies advanced without a check from one victory to another. This period was divided into 2 well-defined phases, the first being the breaking through of the Hindenburg Line, and the second the pushing of the enemy before us from his hastily prepared defenses. The second phase had already reached its legitimate conclusion when the signing of the armistice put an end to the operations. Finally defeated in the great battles of November 1 and 4, and utterly without reserves, the enemy at that date was falling back without coherent plan and in widespread disorder and confusion." End of Part 1. Preface and Chapter 1. Recording by David Lawrence in Brampton, Ontario, September 2009.